Welcome to the last talk of this morning session, as it's called here. Our last speaker is Sandro Geiken. Sandro is writing his PhD thesis in Bielefeld. He's been with the CCC for about 10 years, loosely affiliated. And today he's talking about counter-development, the accessibility of technology as an addendum to engineering ethics in the knowledgeable society. Now, he's already regretted the choice of this title. As I understand it, he's going to talk about, well, how the interactions of politics, of participative politics and technology, which I think is a topic that would deserve more listeners. But, well, maybe some people are yet to come. And still, it's 2, so we need to start. And Sandro.
Oh yeah. Thank you for the introduction. Yeah, as I already said, I regretted the long title, which was originally initiated for my scientific audiences, because I'm giving the same talk on a couple of other conferences now in January too. But I too late realized that it might be too unsexy for the Chaos Computer Club. And I changed it now, however, for you, chosen audience, access to technologized politics, and you in particular, because I'm going to address you as technologist within this talk. Yeah, as the chair already said, I'm a philosopher of technology at the Institute for Science and Technology Studies in Bielefeld. I'm largely doing epistemological stuff and science theory of the technical sciences, but I'm also engaged in the ethics of technology and political theory of technology, political philosophy of technology. And today I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to present you with an argument on why hacking, actually, which I will term a little different, has to do substantially with resistance as a fundamental access to politics. And just to give you a brief outline of what I will be doing, first, as I said, my argument will rest on resistance. So first I will try to talk a little about resistance, what it is, and I will try to develop a notion of resistance as access to the social contract. Then I will talk about some very basic conditions of resistance which have to be fulfilled to allow resistance to be a meaningful concept. That will be the first chunk of my talk about resistance. Then, having these conditions in mind and a demand which can be followed from there, I will start to talk about political technologies, which as which I will understand technologies which are being involved in political actions. And we'll take a brief look on what that actually means and how far technologies are able to alter political actions and to give a different notion to them, which is politically substantial as well. And then we'll have a special look at what happens with certain high-tech structures when high technologies are being introduced in politics. And as a result of that second part, it will turn out that the basic conditions of resistance, which have been stated in the first part, cannot be guaranteed anymore when high technology is being introduced in political technologies. And that, of course, is a very bad situation. And so I will try to evaluate a little in the third part of my talk how access to high-tech politics can actually be maintained, and the concept which I will try to introduce here will be counter-development. So to start, first of all, the notion of resistance as access to the social contract. On a very basic level, we can view society, or many societies actually try to have this arrangement of ruling, which is that they appoint a certain class or type of rulers, and those are then committed to act in their best interest and to do politics in their interest. And this commitment can be seen as somewhat of a contractual basis. Philosophy has termed this the social contract in many different accounts. And the contractual basis somewhat consists of a ruler being committed to act in the best interest of his people, and this is of course accompanied by a couple of terms and conditions which are then being stated in material forms such as constitutions and laws and electoral practices and stuff. And then on the other hand, the ruled people who chose him are committed to obey to his ruling and to obey the laws which he gives out. So that is the social contract. And a very common form of of social organization. However, there's also a very common form of breaching this contract on behalf of the ruler, and that is called tyranny. Tyranny is somewhat a more ancient word for this. The more accurate word for now would be dictatorship or somewhat. But I like tyranny, so I stick to that. And a tyranny is someone who has either usurped his post or who misuses his powers and is largely unimpressed by any legal means trying to abolish him or to dismiss him from his post again. And if a ruler turns into a tyrant, then that is somewhat a worst case scenario for the social contract, because the more powerful contractee denies his commitments, denies the terms and conditions of the contract, and then there's no sort of upper hand which could rule then over him and dismiss him if he just decides to ignore these dismissals. So the question, of course, is how to regain access to the social contract in such a worst-case scenario. And what we see in history was that what has happened is that resistance in these cases comes up as a means for the people to regain access to the social contract and to regain control over their ruler. So resistance is really a very important thing because it is sort of the ultima ratio, the last means which is available to us if our rulers turn into tyrants. And now to get into this a little deeper, I want to explore two dimensions of resistance, one theoretical dimension and one practical dimension. And the theoretical dimension can be discerned in certain legal and ethical considerations and arrangements. First of all, the legal arrangement is the right of resistance, the so-called right of resistance, that is to maintain the contractual form. It has been introduced in the Middle Ages already as a sort of natural justice, which is above the liege and above the king and being initiated by God. And it stated that it was legitimate to remove a tyrant and even murder and behead him if that aims at restoring order, and if it is the ultima ratio, if all other means have been explored or tried out but didn't work, and if it causes less damage than the tyrant would have, and if it also has a fair chance of success. And in this shape, it is basically every citizen's right to pursue the right of resistance, and nowadays the right of resistance is also a formal right, a legal right. It has a legal form in the Human Charter of Human Rights, and it's also a very basic right in many constitutions, as for instance in the German constitution it is the Article 20, paragraph 4 has been introduced in the 68 student revolts to calm the public a little. And it states that all Germans have a right to resist anyone who undertakes it to remove the constitutionally secured order if no other means are available anymore. So this is really a very fundamental and basic thing. However, the legal form alone doesn't suffice. There's also ethical evaluation involved in this and necessary for this, which basically has to do with finding the precise moment at which one should resist a certain ruling. The question is more or less, when is the constitutionally secured order threatened really as a whole? And we can see that there's space for this ethical evaluation already in the very formulation of the Article 24, because on the one hand it states that we should resist anyone who undertakes it to remove the constitutionally secured order, which would point to the however faint beginnings of such a removal, whereas on the other hand it states that this is only legitimate when no other means are available anymore, which points to the very end of such a removal of the constitutionally secured order. So one really has to find the very own and personal point to depart into action in this somewhere between the very beginnings and the very end of the establishment of a dictatorship. I somewhat like to stick with early moral courage, as John Taylor, US Senator 1821, has said, tyranny in form is the first step towards tyranny in substance. And this, I believe, is historically very warranted, but that's just a matter of personal taste. So that's a theoretical dimension of resistance, but we also know a lot of cultural practices of resistance, and they can be broadly categorized in the following way. First distinction runs between active and passive resistance. Active resistance is commonly known as everything which has to do with murder and mayhem, burning cars and dead people. Whereas passive resistance is a concept also known for long, but only popular since Gandhi's Ahimsa movement, who was very successful with this passive resistance thing, which is resistance which explicitly refrains from violence. And within the passive resistance, we can also discern two other types of measures. We can discern indirect measures which have no immediate bearing on the causal context they're concerned with, and an example, a popular example for that would be Henry David Thoreau, the formal inventor of civil disobedience, who was opposed to the American-Mexican War and to the treatment of the American natives, but was incapable of interfering directly with these stately affairs, so he just decided to withdraw his monetary support of the state by refusing to pay tax. So that is an indirect way of resisting certain rulings. But there's also the other type of direct measures which do have an immediate bearing on the causal thing they're concerned with, and house squattings or blockades can count as that. And also, of course, Gandhi has given very popular examples, as for instance, he was opposing the British monopolies on textiles and salt by just telling the Indian people to produce their own textiles and produce their own salt. So that was directly interfering with the thing he was concerned with. And somewhat the passive direct measures are ethically preferable because, as we have seen in the basic outline of resistance, what resistance should do, it should cause less damage and have a good chance of success. And because passive direct measures have all the benefits of indirect measures, like drawing attention, demonstrating things, but also interfere directly with the causal things they're concerned with, they're somewhat mostly more effective and somewhat ethically preferable in the general case. Although, of course, the evaluation has to be done individually for every resistance. Every certain type of resistance has a specific individual set of consequences, of course. So to sum this up a little, as we have seen, resistance is, in fact, despite what the Borg say, not useless, but a very important ultima ratio to regain access to the social contract in the worst case scenario of a ruler turning into a tyrant. And it does have some legal and ethical foundations, and also some cultural practices in humanity. And if we now look at resistance from a very, very basic point of view, we can see that this relies on some very basic conditions which have to be fulfilled to make resistance actually a meaningful concept. For the legal and ethical evaluation, we have to see that political measures have to be visible and intelligible to some extent, because we have to be able to discern certain political measures, political actions as illegitimate, as unconstitutional in the first place, and then we have to be able to clearly distinguish which intentions are behind there, who's involved, and so on and so forth. And so in other words, for resistance to be a meaningful concept and to decide when to resist and to see when you have to resist, politics have to be cognitively accessible. And of course, this is not a trivial demand. It's largely known as well. I mean, the free independent press is largely concerned with trying to make political measures visible and intelligible, whereas PR agencies and secret services are trying to do the opposite. So this is a very basic condition which is already involved in a certain degree of social struggle. And there's also another very basic condition which is more concerned with the practice of resistance. And for practical action, we have to realize that political measures also have to have some physical outgrowth. And in the ethically preferable case of passive direct resistance, for instance, it should be the physical outgrowth of the very measure which is being undertaken. So the action itself should be physically accessible to some degree. Of course, this might seem like a very trivial thing to say, because politics always do have some physical outgrowth. I mean, in the very last case, it would be the very politician who decides these things. So this appears to be a trivial condition, a trivial thing to state. But as we will see as soon as high technologies become involved in politics, this is not so trivial anymore. So these conditions really have to be maintained, and these conditions are important for resistance to have that as a meaningful concept. And we can state this a little, reformulate this a little into a meaningful demand by saying that political measures have to be cognitively and physically accessible. And we can see, I already stated, the free independent press and some other groups, activists of course as well, are engaged in a social struggle to keep politics cognitively and physically accessible already. We've also seen the forming of social groups like Free Independent Press and activists. And however, the technologists have been very absent from this social struggle as an explicit social group until now. But I believe that this cannot be upheld any longer, and that the technologists as a group should really engage in the social struggle to maintain the conditions for resistance. And I will explore this now when I will start to look at what it means if technology is being introduced in political actions. And I'm trying to this is really a research which I will do in the next 5 years in my habilitation, to try and look at political technologies, the entanglements of politics and technology. Find that very interesting. There is also talk has started on this in sociology of technology, history of technology, under the term of technologized politics, a little just over the past years. But I will try to focus more on the technologies because I'm a philosopher of technology, so that is my angle. And we'll understand these as the technologies of technologized politics. And the definition, which I have just causally stated now, will be that a political technology is a technology which is a substantial part of some political measure, and maybe standardization can be taken as an indicator for certain technology being a substantial part. But I do agree that this is still cause, and one could argue whether a certain pencil of a specific type, which is being standardized for filling out form XYZ, is in the same way substantial as a long-range nuclear missile is substantial for foreign politics. But that's still an open thing. But somewhat this is just a working definition, and the interesting question which can now be followed would be that whether the introduction of technologies actually alters political actions in any politically substantial sense. This is actually the question which I will ask myself for the next 5 years and try to go in there a little deeply. For now, I don't have really a very, very worked out concept. I just have a couple of ideas and this threefold dimensions, which I will just briefly present you now. Values, effectivity, exclusivity. Values in technology is a thing that the Chaos Computer Club notoriously denies. They always say that technologies are not evil, they're neutral. But in fact, I believe that technologies are never neutral. And I think one way of seeing this is that a very easy thing to approach by saying that technology is always involved in some sort of action, some human action. We always do something with technologies. And when we do something, we have aims in our head. And when we have aims, then these aims rest on some needs and values. And needs, of course, can be reformulated as values. And as such, we find a systemic net of values and needs in every single technology by just what we be able to do with that and how it is being developed and produced. And you can see this easily in any sort of car. If you drive a Corvette Stingray, for instance, your ultimate need is not to come from A to B, because then you would probably buy a different car, but also to impress people and to show off how rich you are and how fast. So there's always a net of values and needs embodied in any technology, and even if comfort can be counted as a value, which seems to be very prevalent and current technological development. And one question which has much to do with my talk now, which I find intriguing, is whether one could try and develop a notion of a global web of values and needs and illustrate and contrast that with the global web of values and needs as they are realized by technologies. And just to give you an idea what that could be about is if you, for instance, just see how much money is being invested in the tiny little details which nobody needs in our gadgets, and you contrast that with the money which is being invested in the development of devices to clean water, which would be very substantially needed by quite a few people to actually survive, then you can see that there's a huge difference of actual values which should be pursued in technological development and which are quite asymmetric to the values which are being pursued by technological development. But that's just an idea for the future. Yeah, another thing is the effectivity of technology. Of course, what technology usually does is technology enhances certain actions, or technology enables certain actions, as in the case of flying. We wouldn't be able to fly without airplanes. So these are, of course, the standard things which technology do. They somewhat add something to our actions. And another point is also exclusivity of technology, that is that technology of a certain step of development is only manageable by experts, and that it is of course only affordable by the rich or powerful, which applies in particular to greater technological compounds and stuff like that. And also the directions of development are of course given by those people rich and powerful enough to afford experts. And these are things which have to do with politics as well. And in which way can be seen now, we can discern some immediate dangers now if we see these effects of technology being carried over and embodied into politics, political actions. We can then see that political technologies are actually quite able to realize nasty values within political actions, and these are especially tricky when they're somewhat contradictory, as contradictory values, for instance, are control and freedom, or security and freedom, or profit and labor, because if you try to enhance the one thing, then you automatically seem to, I mean, it's not a necessity, but you seem to have to diminish the other things. So that's something which political technologies can do and which they can introduce into the political actions. Then another difficult thing they could do, of course, is that they could enhance or enable illegitimate political measures in this effectivity thing. And another thing would be that they could also be managed, owned, and developed by politically strongly biased people, which of course has been the case in the voting computer industry in the US, which has been determined by Diebold, which are strongly politically biased towards the Republicans. So this is just a brief outlook to just really state this very basic thing now, that we can say that all these things seem to point to the fact that political technologies can actually be a very substantial part of political action and can alter politics in some sense or another. So that would be a natural thing to assume, and we can now renew our demand, the demand I have stated on political actions, for the case of political technologies, that political technologies should be cognitively and physically accessible too. However, we now encounter immediate problems when we look at certain high-tech structures, when politics are actually being interspersed with high technologies. And I just want to highlight three basic structural components of high technologies. The first component is intelligence. We see intelligence, a strong increase in intelligence in our daily lives in many aspects. Another philosopher has termed this the logical malleability of technological devices, and which are being intelligent. And this has a twofold effect. The first effect is that it is of course handy for us to have devices which are able to think and to do things for us while we're away, or to interact with us. So it's quite a natural thing to develop ever more intelligence into ever more devices of our daily life. And the other effect is that our own intelligent processes, our cognitive processes, can be supported by intelligence, and thus ever more of our own intelligent processes are being technologized in a way. Like when I use this PowerPoint thing here, then that helps certain cognitive processes of mine to be visualized, and so thus I have outsourced a part of my intelligent processes into a technology. And these two effects really have the effect that intelligence is being embodied into ever more processes, daily procedures, our cognitive processes, daily life, ever more things that will be an unstoppable thing for the future. And the danger, of course, is that you never know whose intelligence actually is there in detail, because intelligence, of course, might invite foreign interests and agendas, and by this interspersion of intelligence with our daily lives, these foreign interests and agendas might just be introduced in a very subtle way. A second feature which has to do with intelligence, of course, is complexity. Complexity is insofar complicated as it makes high-tech structures or high technologies very hard to understand or to control for lay people, and sometimes also impossible to understand or control at all, which is to say that even experts will not be able to fully reconstruct what's happening in a computer down to the very last detail. Or this applies even more to the case of genetic engineering or to nanotechnology, where the basic fundamentals are not understood at all, and the complex interactions with the natural surroundings are not understood at all and cannot be controlled. And So that is a very difficult structural feature of high technology as well. And third and last difficult structure in high technology is virtuality as well, which is difficult in two respects. On the one hand, one difficulty is that your local branch of technology shares a universally accessible virtual space. When it is a communicative technology of some sort, then that means that you are accessible from the virtual space. Your local branch is accessible from the virtual space. And of course, we all know what the implications of this are as far as surveillance is concerned. And another feature of virtuality is that it also makes certain technical procedures partly unphysical, as you might not be able to physically directly interfere with somebody who's intercepting your communication because it's just happening entirely out of your bounds. And the same feature of unphysical virtuality somewhat also applies to technologies which are simply beyond our reach, such as satellites, surveillance satellites, or stuff like that. So if we now take into account these structures and we see what happens when high technology is being introduced into politics, then we can see that high political technologies can actually render political actions in very bad ways. They can make them biased by introducing foreign interests and foreign agendas into these politics. They can make them invisible because they can hide them in the complexity of the apparatus. They can make them unintelligible almost instantaneously because only experts will be able to reconstruct what actually is happening and who is interested in what and who is biased in which way. So that really becomes a very complicated thing in complex high technologies. And they can also render certain political actions entirely unphysical and physically very hard for us to access. And one example is the Vorratsdatenspeicherung. What's that in English, actually? Data retention, yeah. One very nice example is data retention, which is a process entirely unphysical to us because we have no direct possibility to interfere with that in any physical way. And now, if we now remind ourselves of the demand we have stated that politics should be cognitively and physically accessible, and that also political technologies should be cognitively and physically accessible, we can now see that the introduction of high technologies into politics renders them cognitively and physically inaccessible. And that, of course, is a very dangerous situation. And we can also discern two different types of inaccessibilities. One I want to term partial inaccessibility, as it applies only to lay people who are not experts in the technical fields and not able to reconstruct these things on their own without a certain degree of expertise. And another inaccessibility, which is even more dangerous, is full inaccessibility in cases where these technologies are even not accessible by experts anymore. So as a consequence, of course, we have to state that fully inaccessible technologies as really a worst case scenario of entirely uncontrollable and unintelligible technologies and or parts of political actions have to be avoided as deeply dystopian in politics at all costs. And actually dystopian literature for me is always a very good backdrop to analyze these things, because most dystopian scenarios are really concerned with technologies which have become inaccessible and which somewhat determine the political course of life. And one very early example, dystopian example, would be the automatic doomsday machine which the Russians have invented in Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, which is inaccessible then once it is initiated, and so on and so forth. So that is the demand which would apply to fully inaccessible technologies. But the thing which we have to be concerned with more narrowly in our daily basis will be partially inaccessible technologies, technologies which are not accessible to the lay public. Of course, they should be avoided too in political actions, but due to this feature of logical malleability, we will not be able to avoid them, and this will just simply happen. And what we have to do then in this case would be to recover the accessibility. And these are largely technical tasks, of course, to say that. To realize when a technology is fully inaccessible is a technical task and can only be done by somebody who knows technology and who knows what's happening and going on there. And also to recover accessibility is also a technical task, because you have to understand this and be able to translate it and to do something against it. And this path of how to do this, how to come to avoidance and restoration, is a concept which I'm trying to develop now, which many of you, of course, do already, but this is now in the context I have developed. And I've termed it counter-development because it's somewhat the development against evil development, so it counters something. And the core concept of counter-development will consist of these three demands. The first demand will be to restore visibility, and that will entail to alarm the lay public about the presence of technologies in politics whenever that is the case, which is really just basically to get visibility of these things in the first place. And that will have to be accompanied by the second demand to restore intelligibility, to enlighten the public about the specific workings of these machines, of these high technologies, of the functions, of the potentials, the dystopian potentials, whenever these are introduced into politics, and how they could actually alter the politics and bias them and do things with them. And then the third demand, which is more controversial, especially among my philosopher colleagues, is that we should also be concerned with restoring the physicality of these things. And namely, countermeasures should be developed to any political technologies which are even potentially questionable, to make them accessible again in any case of misuse by any tyrant. So we really would have to supply sabotage devices or sabotage guides to the lay public to allow them to disable features which suppress them in highly technologized politics. And these three demands then directly aim at restoring what we have discerned in the first part as the basic conditions for resistance. If we follow these, then visibility and intelligibility can be restored, and politics will be made cognitively accessible, and physicality can be restored as well to make politics also, again, physically accessible. However, there will be some more, and I haven't gone into these too deeply, but there will be some more demands as well entailed or implied by counter-development. The fourth would, of course, be concerned with these full inaccessibilities, that dystopias have to be destructed, full inaccessibilities have to be pointed out explicitly, and removed if necessary, if nobody acts on them. And another more general demand, of course, would be to raise some sort of general awareness, which is a demand which would more apply to the meta-technical community, people like me or sociologists, historians, politicians of technology, to enlighten the public about the general implications and entanglements of politics and technology, and what happens and how inevitable disasters and some developments are when these things happen. For instance, as history has shown, is that technologies which are once introduced in certain types of political actions are never ever being removed again. That's a very disturbing fact, and the public should really be enlightened about the role technology plays in politics, because I do not think that they really realize how devastating they can be within politics. So, and now this all applies to you here in the audience personally very much, because counter-development, if we now say that counter-development is somewhat a necessity, is a necessary thing to guarantee an ongoing access to politics in the high-tech age, because counter-development is the only thing that allows us to restore accessibility and make resistance as the last means to access the social contract, a meaningful concept again, then this is largely your job. I mean, counter-development can only be done by the technical community. The lay public cannot do this. And this renders somewhat the technical community into a social group which has to be engaged in the social struggle over these accessibilities. And what we would probably need would be something an equivalent to the free independent press in terms of technologists. We would need something like the free independent technologist, who's able to translate what is happening in technologies into understandable concepts to make these things visible. And in addition to what the press does, the press only does this translation thing, the free independent technologists should also provide countermeasures, really physical things to counteract certain high-tech political actions. And as such, from a philosophical point of view, counter-development is really an ethical obligation for every individual technological expert. So that has been my argument largely. I just want to go through it again for you as a reminder now for the discussion. We have stated that political measures have to be physically and cognitively accessible to allow resistance as access to the social contract in worst-case scenarios. Then we have seen that high technologies introduce partial or full inaccessibilities into political measures, or are capable of doing so, and thus alter political measures in a very substantial way. And we have then stated that full inaccessibilities, of course, have to be avoided, and partial inaccessibilities have to be removed by counter-development. And by realizing that counter-development really is a technical task, we're also able to state that counter-development is a new ethical duty for the technical community. Okay, so this has been my talk here, my presentation. There's also an article coming up on this topic, counter-development, is forthcoming in the International Journal of Technology, Knowledge and Society, which will appear in, I don't know, February, March sometime. But I can also send you a slightly different version of that. If you're interested, you can just send me an email and I'll send it to you as a PDF. And thank you.
Well, thank you, Sandro. Any questions, comments?
So you say a lot about cognitive things and about the physical things, but what do you think about emotions? I think emotions are really so we must to understand it, or to what we want what we have to do with emotions in this shame. Oh, German.
What do you think, how technologies manipulates people emotionally, or what do you...
I don't think it's so simple that manipulate, who is manipulated and so, and I can say it now, but I think that you're drawing really interesting pictures, but I don't understand which role have the emotions in this theory. So I think that because of this social life, it's not only with the cognitive things, you not only think, and feeling is not only physical. I think not physical like a touch, but emotional. So
yeah, well, I mean that would go really deeply into this phenomenology of technologies stuff, which is the philosophical discussion on how we live with technologies and how we actually mix and form a synthesis of. I mean, I know you're a sociologist of technology, but I don't really understand the concept of how to embody this into politics. Maybe we just have to talk about that later. I don't have a picture now.
Okay, I just say it for all because of I think like a iPod is sexy, and so it's not a cognitive thing, and
Okay,
it's
yeah.
really, but it's really important.
Yeah, you have to explain that to me later. I don't get it now.
Further questions, contributions?
Okay, thank you for your talk. I would like to make some more explicit links to talks that have been made on the first day. You talked about the voting computers, the talk that was given by Rob. I can't pronounce his surname, so I won't do it. And how we need accessibility and visibility. And I think if we think about voting computers and how they actually make the voting itself, the whole vote, inaccessible to some kind and unintelligible for people who don't understand computers. I think that's a very important point. So that's the point where we should oppose such things as voting computers and voting, electronic voting, for example, as well. So that would be, I would totally support your argument there. And there has been another talk on the first day about data retention. So you mentioned data retention already, by Ulrich Wiesner, and he was talking about how we give up a lot of freedom with data retention, for example, to gain only a little bit of security. And I think what is the problem here too, what Ulrich pointed out was that most of the politicians don't really understand why they use the technology, and that they use the technology, but they don't really see what they're doing to the public with it. They only have certain aims in their mind, but they don't really see what these aims or what the means they use for it also imply. So that would be another way to support your argument there. But it also points to the fact that, or I would like to point to the fact that we need not only to inform the public, but also the politicians at that point. they make use of political technologies or technology in general, but yeah, they don't really see what's happening with this technology or what it implies, what it all like all the implications. So yeah, I would like to add to your argument that we need to inform the politicians as well. And my last question would be, you said that technology is never neutral. I think we need to use technology as well. So as a means for doing something, it might be neutral, but we use it for different aims. So I wouldn't necessarily say that technology is evil or bad or something, or never neutral, but that the aims we use them for are never neutral. So if we, for example, counter development, you might also term it as hacking, for example. We sort of use the technology for a different aim. So we might have like a left-wing aim, and the politicians might have a right-wing aim, but we use the same technology. So yeah, I would oppose that because it sort of it enhances technophobia, I think, and we as the technologists, as you say, also make use of technology, so we shouldn't enhance technophobia at that point. And I'm talking too much, sorry. And the last point I would like to make is I'm not a totally computer expert. I wouldn't fit into your category of the independent technologist, but as a person who's dealing with technology and using technology, I can still say at some point, oh, I don't understand this, and I don't understand what's going on. And I think that's something that everyone can do. Every person who's using technology or who's at some point not understanding what's happening. So I wouldn't restrict it to these free independent technologists, but also to all the people who say, I'm dealing with this and I don't understand it, and that's bad for me because I don't know what's going on. And yeah, then the free independent technologists come into play, and they should explain what's going on. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. No, totally. Just to hook on to that, then of course, everybody should be concerned with this, but we do know, but we do need the technical community in the first place to realize just what's going on. I mean, and what is going on. I mean, you do need some information about voting computers, for instance, by Rob, or you do need some background information on data retention to actually just realize that this is dangerous in the first place, because there's too much going on which you don't understand or don't see anyway. So you have to direct your attention to something, and that is something which the technical expert has to decide somewhat for you, to say that this is more dangerous than the harvesting machine which is being built there next door. Then the other point, of course, what you said on that, for instance, technologies can be used by the bad guys and by the good guys, and thus they're neutral. That's the very standard philosophical argument for the neutrality of technology, of course. It has been opposed in many ways, but one way it would be to say that technologies have a tendency to lend themselves towards certain things. Another thing is to say that you also have to distinguish the different dimensions of use, production, and development. Because then production and development are also guided by certain aims and values, and those go into the technology as well. As for instance, I have computers, for instance, use semiconductors, and semiconductors are the most poisonous thing to produce at the moment, are only being produced in very poor countries by people which, in companies which don't have to apply to any work laws, and the people who are working there are very sick and get cancers all the time. And so these values go into these machines as well. You know, there's blood on my computer, so to speak. But that's a difficult argument anyway, this neutrality of technology. It's just a personal matter of taste, more or less, if you want to accept that or not. I don't. And then your other point to raise awareness within politicians, that's of course a very important thing. Yeah, thank you for that thing.
Well, I've put me on the speakers list for a second. One thing that raised a bit of alarm for me was your your point about the complexity that needed to be reduced to get the layman, or to provide accessibility to laymen. Well, as a fan of Enlightenment, not the window manager, the historical period, I would rather say, wouldn't it be better in this particular case to see this from to try to change this from the people's side rather than from technology's side? I agree that certain technologies can be made more accessible, but I think once you deny there is complexity, and once you leave the people who use the technology out of the picture and just try to make technology accessible by dumbing it down, you probably lose quite a bit. And I think a fan of Enlightenment would have to say, well, let's educate the people. Let's educate the people. Let's change technology as well. Let's make it more transparent. Let's make it, Debian is more transparent than Windows maybe, because you can really see what's going on. That's a good thing. But let's resist the temptation to dumb technology down just to provide the illusion. And I think it would be an illusion of accessibility. What do you think about that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, we're talking about the case of the introduction of technology into politics here, and and I think within politics we should try to maintain a certain simplicity, because only simplicity can really fully guarantee transparency and intelligibility for everyone, because otherwise not everyone will care about this complexity thing. And a good case in point is the voting computer. Why on earth would we abandon the system with just making a cross on a piece of paper and 3 people checking it? It's much more easy, it's very simple, and it's a political process which is very important and which can be disturbed very much by the introduction of a computer in there. So I would say that in general, I would just state that as a preference, if it is possible to have a simple thing rather than a complex thing, and if that isn't associated with any substantial loss of value or of whatever you want to achieve with that, then I would generally prefer the simple case over the complex one. And in the other case, of course, you're right, we should just maintain the complex thing and then enlighten people about the complexities in there, and try to maintain transparency as good as possible.
Choices determining technological development very often happen by political choices, which are not publicly debated, if not by business. One good instance of that would be spectrum and broadcasting technologies, because having chosen one type of regulation, basically one type of technology was chosen which had certain incumbents behind it. So I think that in this day and age, a very important point would be to create an imperative of accountability by political structures when they make technological choices, because those are things that produce basically the dominant technological environment, and those are the points where public can, within a constituted political environment, so an ordinary or ordered political environment, intervene into technological choices which are being made, and they are not being made only for the sake of technology. And a second point is that those choices oftentimes happen indirect through means of optimization. I mean, voting machines were chosen primarily through this logic of optimization, and this also has to be increasingly accounted on. So I think that we should also strive towards a redefinition of how political structures or structures of political decision-making make technological choices, and make those things account, or points in the structure account for the choices they make. So particularly when it comes to optimization, I think that it's a strong argument which oftentimes does away with the political debate as to what technologies we choose or not.
Yeah, no, totally. I totally agree with this. Maybe I should make that as a sub point of this raise awareness thing as well. That politics should be aware, of course, of the values and needs which are being introduced, also by optimization, as you said, because optimization in itself has some certain values, and then also is able to carry other values in there. And of course, it should be made more aware to the politicians that they are not only just optimizing a certain kind of process, but also gambling with values in these cases. So I totally agree with your point.
Okay, I'd like to ask about definitions of control, and the reason I want to ask about that is to question what you were saying about how the technologists are the kind of responsible agents for the counter-development. And I would look at like privacy-enhancing technologies, as in anonymizers or the free net, as also political technologies. I don't know if you see it as such. And in a way, these technologies are about avoiding processes of control by introducing other ways of control. So if you look at cryptography, or even, anonymizer itself, most pets are actually control mechanisms. So I wonder if there's a positive and negative definition of control, I don't know. Or is there another way of defining security or abolishing security or deconstructing security, which as a technologist I cannot do, but I would expect, for example, somebody who's read lots of Foucault to be able to give me some feedback, which I haven't done. But I'm just wondering if you have different definitions of control and security, which would help technologists question mechanisms of control, or to produce technologies that do something else. That subvert or are counter developments. I think without these ideas, it's difficult to develop technologies as well. So it's a cooperation.
Yeah, thank you for that remark. Actually, yeah, that's quite true. I mean, there would have to be some sort of proactive version of counter development, because I formulated it very negatively here in a way to more trying to disturb and destruct certain developments and things, but. Of course, like these privacy things which are trying to put a certain type of control to control these other people who are trying to control something else, would have to be introduced there, which would be, of course, a case to an example for restoring physicality in this sense, to try to make your communication non-interceptable and to give you back the control. But I totally agree. Maybe I should make my argument more fine-grained there and add this as some sort of a proactive thing. But I don't know if we do need to, maybe my notion of control was somewhat negative. I didn't intend that. I should probably formulate that a little more neutral. Thank you.
I would like to add that I'm also in favor of reducing complexity in our stuff more than educating people. Of course, I'm always in favor of educating people and enlightening them. That's, of course, always a very good thing to do and also important thing. But one thing is, I believe that our technology has, and culture using it has advanced too far for the average person to be able to understand things. And it's just too big a demand that people are educated in a way that, for example, would them allow to understand the inner workings of a voting machine. And I mean, I'm not even able to educate myself as much as I would like to, and I think it's needed. So I think it's a very tough job to educate other people if you can't even do it to yourself enough. And I think there's a bit of a danger of abuse if you say that people should be educated, or if one demands that people should be educated about the high technology, because it could be said that, well, our technology is so complex, it has to be, you just have to understand it. And if you don't, then go educate yourself and we will use it in the time being, and you don't have to understand it because we are the experts. And that is a danger, because this is a thing I think should just not be accepted. It has to be simple, and it has to be made simple, and if the technology is too complex inherently, then it cannot be used for these political means. Like the voting computer, for example. Even if it would save lots of money and be fast and whatever, if it is inaccessible, and I think this is a case of full inaccessibility, because even the experts needed to to do very hard and long reverse engineering to get to know what really goes on. So nobody really can know in any normal or acceptable way. So this just has to be avoided. And if it's more expensive and slower to count all the votes by hand, which actually it doesn't seem to be, then we just have to accept that and do it, because it's, well, they're just not that important as the understandability of the things by the people.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. I mean, that's really a thing I'm a lot in favor of. I mean, this one thing about enlightening the people. I've tried to. I'm still on it, trying to do a project within the Chaos Computer Club, which aims at precisely providing understanding and precise manuals for the public on how these things understand, to provide these translations. And the idea I had for that was to give like two different versions. Like the one version would just be very coarse and very easy understandable. Like if you use this technology, then this and this crap could happen. Because of this and these certain things in a very broad and coarse functional language. And then also to provide the more detailed account of what could happen for anybody who is interested, in fact, to get into the details more narrowly. So that would just be a matter of procedure and within counter development, how you could actually just, you know, provide different versions of these things to make it still maintain it as interesting for the public. And then another thing which you have addressed was that there might be abuse of this, and I'm fully aware of the potential of abuse once you give countermeasures to the public, that there will always be some guy who is making full use of that just because he was pissed off with some bureaucrat or something. But I think that is a very nice thing, actually, because it renders the introduction of technology into politics quite impossible and quite dangerous for the politicians, and so they will think thrice about doing it. That's just my point.
Okay, we have time for another question, I guess.
It's just a small question. The most surprising thing for me was the physical accessibility of the technology. In the case of the voting computer, it's quite easy to see that there is a thing that you can access and you can beat upon it. But if we think about data retention or things like that, it's not only the technology but also the data that isn't physically accessible, and other concepts to relate the technology and the data that's been gathered with the technology or stored by technology on the one hand, and the other hand, how do I have to imagine physical accessibility in those cases?
Yeah, I don't know how to really formulate the connection between technology and data, because I'm not a technologist. I'm a meta-technologist, but not really a hacker. I do not know anything about these things in any greater detail. I could tell you some nice philosophical theories about it later, but yeah, I mean, what we really need is to this sort of physical accessibility. I mean, another term to phrase this would be sabotage. To simply, what we have to do is to provide sabotage devices for any sort of procedures or processes which are potentially politically biased, or which have a tendency to lean themselves to bad dystopian political scenarios. So that, I mean, that's like the core idea I have in my subversive mind in the back, to really, and that would be like also as you said, to have a proactive thing of this in mind as well, not just to disturb certain things or to avoid or to refrain from using communication because it can be intercepted, but also to sabotage your opponent by a number of different means.
Yeah, maybe a comment. We should, in a way, I think we should try to live with the fact that we already, since so long time, we delegated part of our lives to experts. So technology is just another field, but since so many years, we delegated our health to doctors. We trust them in a way. The fact that maybe the fact that they are enough there have enough doctors on the market, and they not always agree one with the other, gives us a kind of access to what they say and contradict and stuff like this. But still, we don't really understand what they say and what they do to ourselves. On the other side, maybe about the access to technology, I don't know where is the balance to find between, I would say, just to give an image, if you have television, state-controlled television with just one channel, and you have only the government programs, and then after we liberalized it, we gave many channels to people, and the remote control, they choose to watch Fame Academy. We should try to learn to live with. Also, not everybody wants to be educated.
Yeah, thank you for this comment. That's true, of course, but I mean, this whole discussion is really going on in this whole big chunk of debates about the knowledgeable society and about the impact of experts in a society which consists and decides exceedingly more based upon scientific opinion and expert opinion. So I think that is a general feature of our society. It does not only grow more complex in the field of medicine or in the field of technology, it grows more complex everywhere because everything is being transcended by scientific knowledge. And but I do believe that this idea I had about having free independent technologists, or free independent experts in general, who are trying to produce unbiased translations of complex going-ons, is a very important thing in there. So, because one big problem in the knowledgeable society is that we do have a lot of fake experts. I mean, we do have all sorts of politicians employ their own experts, and they tell them in advance what they're supposed to find out. I mean, in the US, you have really terrible scenarios. You have this Cato Institute, which is a totally right-wing think tank, and they have idiots like Thomas Moore in there, who's being paid by the oil industry, to produce large amounts of data which state that global warming is a very nice thing indeed, and we should support our industry but in producing more carbon dioxide. And then the bad thing, of course, is that the politicians say, hey, we have this other guy, he says entirely different things, so we decide independent of your expert opinion. And so I believe that this thing, the idea of having free independent experts and establishing these free independent experts within society as some sort of an institution in the same way we have the free independent press is a very important thing.
Okay, we've run out of time. You can talk to Sandro in person, I guess. He'll be here for some time. Have a nice morning break, and let's thank Sandro again.
Thank you.